Good afternoon. I am Shrijita. I am doing my MPhil from the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and we have Vani.
I'm Vani and I am a major in psychology, MPhil in education, currently doing my PhD, and I worked with Burmese refugees for almost 9 years now.
Okay, so Mani, tell me something that this research that you're doing, what kind of, which generation of refugees are you looking at? Are you looking at first generation, second generation? Because I understand from whatever little psychology that I know that, the kind of effects that migration would have on the different generations would be tempered.
Yeah.
So how do you look at that, and what generation of refugees are you looking currently?
Right. I think I'm not picking out a new sample right now. My comparative analysis and study of Burmese and Tibetans will take place in the next 2-3 years. But what I have done, these were political activists, and they did not migrate and leave Burma with families. Now that's a very important thing, because then you're looking at individuals who came to a country without any documents, money, clothes, anything, and they just ran for their life. Now those are the people I'm dealing with, and even though the political situation in Burma has changed ever since Aung San Suu Kyi was taken off house arrest, they've not considered going back. Now that's an interesting thing that's happened, because my research started while she was on house arrest, and what impact it had on, say, individuals returning and how they're adjusting, because then India was supposed to provide them with basic rights, but then again India is not a signatory to the 1951 convention, which would then have a legal status of a refugee. So technically they're perpetually in a limbo state. And so I've interviewed, the minimum age of a refugee was 19 years and the oldest was 51. So it's not any particular age group, but it's a range of refugees, because I also used convenience sampling for my research, because this is one of the limitations of my research, because you can't generalize things, because obviously it's a limited sample. There was a range of issues that came up, but there are similar themes that you tend to explore with this age range in this as well, because they don't have families, and there were no refugee children. So and they migrated. So some of the families migrated later, and that's also probably because of the threat these individuals felt that they, kind of had on their families. I think 2 of the refugees I interviewed, their families were killed because of their political presence in Burma. And it's a military regime.
Something which is very similar to my kind of research is, because even I'm doing qualitative research, is that we constantly ask questions about sample size. I mean, how big is your sample?
Yeah.
Even when you tell them that probably you're doing life history interviews. So sample size, especially when you're talking about persecuted communities, or communities which are illegal communities, sample size becomes a huge issue, because you don't get access to them in the first place, and generally research tends to be time bound.
Yes.
Whether it's especially when you're doing academic research. So how do you deal with these questions of qualitative research and sample size, and the kind of limitations of the study itself?
There are a lot of limitations, because like I said, gaining access is one thing, and the second is to break the wall, which will help you get the data you need. And by that I don't mean the sample, but the actual data that you're going to analyze. That's the the meat you'll get out of the interviews and your interactions with them. Access for me was not as big as an issue, because I knew people who would know Burmese refugees, because they used to give them scholarships for higher education degrees. But a bigger challenge for me was to actually break that wall and get to know them, so that they could share their stories with me. So it took me more time to do my rapport formation. So with a couple of refugees, and especially the young ones who are more vulnerable, I would say, and probably that's something to do with the length of stay that they had in India, because it was recent, were more hostile to people, and they thought that there's no point sharing any story because nothing's going to be done. And they're not going to understand like, okay, why this, why that, but they're just unhappy. And there's a very interesting concept in migration, which is known as acculturation. Right? And acculturation is basically the cultural change that takes place, even the psychological one. So it's an umbrella term for both. Now, I explored that concept, and acculturation kind of looks at different strategies, how you cope with cultures. And I think the bigger challenge, which you asked me, was that I could see a very distinct form of strategies that young people used in comparison to older people. On that spectrum, say somebody from 19 to 27 years of age group would be more separated from the Indian community as compared to somebody having a more integrative approach to be a part of Delhi or the culture, or they would make an effort to be a part of like an Indian community as compared to people who just be like, I have nothing to do with these people. And that's also because of the discrimination they experience, and that comes on us because we're the host country. And whatever interactions I had with Indians or Delhiites who I asked them about refugees and what they know about Burmese refugees, they had no idea per se because they thought that they were Northeastern individuals and not
because it was basically about
the
physical
characteristics. Okay. Yes. So my major challenge was a language issue because these people are not so fluent in English. So you have institutes like the Don Bosco trying to rehabilitate them and trying to give them help.
What language do they speak?
So there's again a range of languages, and I had a translator who was making. So they were going to write words in English for me sometimes, and that's where you know what they say about lost in like communication and translation.
Okay.
So then I also tried to use art to
So do you think that probably knowing their language would have been a plus point, and that could be one of the
I think having a translator really helped because I could probe more. Had I not had a translator, then I could have not probably probed more, and also how to get through to them. So these are people like I spent time with them, and then there was a translator, like so it was a whole process of them feeling safe, and that in itself. And sometimes they told me that this was the first time they were sharing their story, and they did not get a chance for expression. Now that's a problem, and that's the biggest threat to their mental health, and nothing's been done to rehabilitate them psychologically. Now that was the biggest challenge, and it still remains, because you can look at like assistance, like I said before, for like housing and shelter and food and education also, but if you're not talking to someone about survival in a new culture, then they're going to end up.
So yeah, that's very, very close to what probably the capability approaches of Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, that it's not enough to give them books, but you need to teach them how to read.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think that makes migration so much more challenging, and rehabilitation, not just a political action, but a social as well as a psychological one.
I think we had this discussion where we're talking about migration and migrants. We should not see them as new people, but as partners. That's what we were discussing in the keynote address today. And to see migrants as partners. Now, I'm not sure how much of that can be done in the case of refugees, considering they're in exile. How I would perceive a refugee as a partner for a developmental change. But yes, to rehabilitate them, the approach has to be holistic and at multiple levels. It can't be just educational, it can't be just healthcare, it can't be just anything else, but it has to be all in one.
But I think I'll just, probably beg to differ a little bit, because when you're not seeing refugees as partners, then there's always this understanding of patronage that you kind of give. So because I'm rehabilitating you, I have some sort of a patronizing influence on you. So if
I understand that. I'll clarify that. Partners in the sense of they can't help you to rehabilitate them per se, but your task force has to be equipped and cutting edge to anticipate the needs that they might have. Now, I could go back to a house, but they're going to go back to like living with 19 people in a small room in Vikaspuri. Now, I know that you're not coming from the same background, but to be able to help them, there has to be more awareness, and then you can help them. And partners, migrants can be, yes, but then there's this perennial debate about say, how do you categorize a refugee per se? See, once they're at that level, I think that they can contribute to say like, and I think a lot of places are doing vocational and skill development, so that's a good thing. But you can't have that for a depressed person. If a person's depressed, they're not going to get up and want to work tomorrow, or like, but they have to work because they have no money. And I think like to realize the needs at a very grassroots level is important, and then probably get them to the level that yes, they can also contribute. And it's not actually seeing them as inferior, but to realize that you need to do a whole lot more for their development than they can do.
Thank you, Ani. The crux of the discussion was that, you know, rehabilitation was first of all, how do you rehabilitate refugees? Because it's not just, as you know, as we discussed, it's not just a political or a social act only, but it's also a psychological one, where you need to take care of not just their food and their, you know, education, but also their mere survival. And interestingly, also we came across this spectrum that when does a refugee become a migrant who becomes a partner for development? So these two very interesting points came up during the discussion, which was fascinating. So thank you, Anya.
Thank you.